The wind was a knife that carved across the cliff's edge, carrying fine grains of dust that hissed against the stone like burning sparks. Kaelin stood at the precipice, her red hair whipping wildly around her fox-like ears, the strands glowing like fire against the deep bruise-colored sky. Her pale skin caught the last glimmers of twilight, making her appear almost spectral, a figure half belonging to this world and half beyond it. Her lips moved, forming words so old their meanings had become song more than speech. Every syllable was meant to honor the end, her end, and the end of her people. She had led the monstrous predator here, to the final altar, and she was ready to offer herself to it. This was not fear, it was inevitability. Her body was rigid with acceptance, her eyes shut, her entire being tuned to the cadence of the lament. Then the ground trembled, not from her chant but from the thunder of footsteps. The grave beast, black as molten stone and vast as a fortress wall, hauled its massive body up from the abyss. Its eyes burned red with a hunger older than history, and Kaelin knew the moment had come. She lifted her face toward it, whispering the last phrase of the death song, when a violent shriek tore through the air. It was not the creature's roar. It was a sound of machinery, high-pitched and cutting, that shattered the sacred silence. The force of it threw Kaelin to the ground. She gasped, ears ringing, body pressed hard against the rock. When she lifted her head, a figure stood where she had been, a man, clad in rugged gear, his dark hair cropped close, his stance braced with the weary readiness of someone who had been fighting the world for far too long. In his hands was a strange device, its emitter horn glowing faintly as it pulsed with power. The beast staggered, disoriented, but not stopped. "Get back," the man shouted, his voice rough in the Galactic tongue. Kaelin's fury was instant, sharp as a blade. This human had desecrated the moment, her people's right. But before she could speak, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip iron, dragging her toward the safety of a narrow fissure in the cliff wall. She resisted, snarling in her own language, her fox-like ears flat against her head. He did not listen. His pull was relentless, survival in motion. The predator charged, its weight shaking the cliff like thunder. Just as its massive head lunged forward, they vanished into the darkness of the fissure. The beast's snarl bellowed outside, its enormous bulk unable to fit through the narrow slit. Its frustrated roar shook the stone, sending dust raining from above, before it withdrew into the storm of twilight. Inside, darkness pressed close, broken only by a sliver of fading light. The man slumped against the wall, still holding his humming device. His breathing was harsh, steady, a sound of raw endurance. Kaelin rose, her spine straight, her red hair framing her fox-like ears as her pale face hardened into a mask of scorn. He had stolen her end. "You have no right," she hissed in the high tongue of her ancestors, though he could not understand the words. Her tone, however, was enough. The man, Darius, though she did not yet know his name, ignored her fury. He crouched at the entrance, his hands deftly working with cable and gear, stringing a tripwire across the narrow opening. A crude defense. A profane insult to the sacred moment she had been denied. "It'll be back," he muttered, not looking at her. Kaelin's ears flicked back, her pale face tightening. She had no intention of granting him acknowledgement. Instead, she lifted her chin and stood tall in the half-light, her body a declaration of defiance. When he noticed the gash on her arm, violet blood streaking pale skin, he reached for her gently, a medkit in hand. Kaelin recoiled, pressing herself against the wall, tail bristling behind her as she spat in her language, "Do not touch me." Darius sighed, his shoulders heavy with weariness. "If that festers, you'll be dead weight." "Sit," he said bluntly, already tearing open sterile packs. His voice was flat, without reverence, without hesitation. She hated him for it, yet when his rough fingers cleaned the wound with clinical precision, she did not flinch. His touch was impersonal, but the heat of his hand against her cold skin shocked her, reminding her that she was still alive. Outside, the beast roared again, a sound that promised it would return. Dawn crept into the fissure slowly, painting them both in shades of gray. Kaelin sat in silence, her fury simmering, while the human studied his map with steady eyes. He pointed to the north, his voice pragmatic. My ship went down 30 kilometers that way. Terrain's bad, but we can make it if we move fast. Kaelin's fox ears twitched, her lip curling. You cannot map the will of the great devourer, she said in a tone drenched with scorn. It is fate itself. Darius didn't look up. Fate looks a lot like a predator. And predators can be avoided. Their philosophies clashed in the narrow darkness, as different and irreconcilable as fire and ice. Yet when they stepped out into the dawn together, the fragile truth was clear, their survival was now bound. The morning was cold and brittle, the light fractured through dust-laden skies that stretched endlessly in pale violet hues. Kaelin moved with the quiet grace of her people, her fox-like ears twitching at every distant rumble, her red hair tangled and alive in the wind. She kept her distance from the human, though they were forced to walk the same path. Her heart beat with resentment, each step a reminder of the fate he had stolen from her. Darius trudged forward without pause, his boots crunching over shards of stone. He was a figure of relentless practicality, his rugged clothes patched and worn from survival rather than design. He carried his pack with a weary confidence, checking his bearings against the glowing projection of his multi-tool. To him, every ridge and crevice was not a sacred trial but an obstacle to be analyzed, understood, and surpassed. They were opposites made to clash. Kaelin broke the silence first, her voice cutting like flint. You profaned my people's ritual. You tore me from the embrace of the devourer. Her words were in the galactic tongue now, sharper for his understanding. Darius didn't look up. I pulled you out of a monster's mouth. That's survival, not profanity. Her fox ears twitched back, anger boiling. You do not understand. That was not a beast. It was destiny. Destiny doesn't roar like that, he muttered, scanning the horizon. It hunts. And if you'd had your way, you'd be nothing more than bones under its claws. The air between them was tense, each word a blade. Yet, despite her outrage, Kaelin followed him. Her body moved reluctantly, but some deeper current pulled her along the trail he cut. Perhaps it was survival. Perhaps it was the strange, infuriating gravity that clung to him. Hours passed. They crossed gullies that twisted like scars across the land, climbed ridges sharp enough to tear boots to ribbons, and skirted the edges of ravines where shadows pooled like ink. Darius led with calm certainty, pausing only to glance at his map or adjust their route. Kaelin's silence grew heavier, but her eyes never left him, studying every decision he made. Their path was blocked at last by a collapsed spar of metal, wreckage hurled from some long-ago destruction. The twisted bulk stretched across the ravine, unmovable. Kaelin stopped, her arms crossed. It is the will of the devourer, she said coolly. We go no further. Darius only grunted. He paced along the obstruction, his mind calculating. He seized a fallen pillar of stone, set it against the wreckage, and piled smaller rocks beneath it. His muscles strained as he threw his weight onto the makeshift lever. The spar groaned, lifted just enough to open a passage beneath. Go, he hissed through clenched teeth. Kaelin's ears flicked, her disbelief almost audible. This crude, blunt use of strength and knowledge, it had succeeded where her faith declared futility. She hesitated, then slipped through the gap. The spar crashed down behind her, echoing like thunder through the canyon. Shaken, she walked on in silence. Later, when her foot slipped on loose scree along a cliffside, she would have fallen into the abyss had Darius not caught her. His arm locked around her waist, pulling her tightly against him. Her palms pressed against his chest, feeling the thundering rhythm of his human heart. It was not serene like the chants of her people. It was wild, insistent, alive. She pulled back quickly, her face hot with fury, or something too close to it. Rain began to fall, thin at first, then sharp with acidity that hissed on the stone. Darius yanked her toward an overhang that opened into the mouth of a cave. Inside, the air was stale, stagnant with abandonment. Kaelin froze at the sight. Tattered banners bearing the glyphs of her people clung to the walls. A fire pit lay cold at the center. The camp was theirs, left behind in desperation. Her knees weakened as her fingers brushed the remains of a prayer cloth. She sank to the ground, her fox-like ears drooping, grief written into every line of her body. Darius gave her space. But his instincts led him deeper into the cavern, his multi-tool casting sharp light into forgotten corners. His boot struck something solid. He knelt, brushing away layers of grime, and uncovered a cracked data slate. He worked quickly, splicing power from his pack into the slate. The screen flickered alive. Kaelin was still lost in her morning song when a voice echoed from the device. Mission log, Cycle 1. Veiled communion proceeding on schedule. Subject, designated grave maw, responding to psychic lures. Containment protocols holding. Darius froze. Kaelin's ears pricked. Her gaze turned toward him, confusion shadowing her pale features. He skipped through entries. More of the same, scientific jargon, experiments, lures, pacification attempts. The sacred rite was nothing more than an experiment cloaked in ritual. The final log filled the cavern with screams, containment has failed. It feeds on fear. Initiate the final protocol, the death lament. Broadcast it now. Darius looked at Kaelin. She was trembling, her hands tight around the hem of a prayer banner. Her faith shattered before his eyes. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. Lies. All lies. It's your people's words, he said quietly. Not mine. Her fox ears drooped low, her red hair falling over her face as her world collapsed inward. Her God was no God. Her sacred rite was a weapon that failed. Her destiny had been a cruel misremembered fragment of science. A guttural sound escaped her, a noise of breaking, of grief too vast for words. She folded into herself, sobs racking her frame. Darius did not think. He simply moved. He wrapped his arms around her trembling body, pulling her against him. She resisted only a second, then went limp, burying her face in his jacket. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply held her, anchoring her in silence while the ruins of her faith burned to ash around her. The cavern was still when her sobs finally quieted, the only sound a steady drip of mineral water from the ceiling. Kaelin sat rigid, her fox-like ears lowered, her red hair hanging in a disheveled veil over her pale face. What remained in her was not serenity but something sharper, forged in grief's furnace. Her God was a lie. Her death rite, nothing but the echo of an experiment gone wrong. She had not been honoring her people, she had been reenacting their mistake. The realization cut deep, but instead of crumbling, it hardened her. Darius watched her closely, his tired eyes softer than before. He could see the shift in her, like a blade tempered in flame. She pushed herself to her feet, tail flicking once, her posture tall and unyielding. The lament, she said, her voice raw but steady. It was no prayer. It was a weapon, unfinished, incomplete. My people lacked the strength to wield it without the amplifier. Darius straightened. Then maybe together, we can finish what they couldn't. Her fox ears twitched, catching both his words and the sincerity beneath them. For the first time, she did not see a defiler of her ritual, but an ally standing in the ruins of her faith. They worked side by side in the hours that followed, their differences still palpable, but their purpose aligned. Kaelin sketched maps on the dirt floor with a shard of stone, her fingers tracing paths of psychic resonance that only she could sense. She marked places where the predator's perception would falter, where the land itself could be turned against it. Darius leaned over his holographic topography map, comparing her instinctive tracings to cold data. His hands moved with mechanical certainty, adjusting routes, weighing elevations, calculating blast ranges. Where her insight was intangible, his was precise. Where his logic faltered, her instincts filled the gap. It was oil and water, yet somehow, together, it worked. "We lure it here," he said at last, pointing to a narrow canyon flanked by unstable rock spires. "If it comes through, I can bury it with the last of my seismic charges." Kalen's eyes narrowed, thoughtful. "It will not enter willingly. I will have to call it." "Call it?" Her fox ears flicked back. "Psychic lure. The beast feeds on intent, on fear, on rage. I can sharpen mine into a spear point. It will come." Darius studied her, weighing her words. Then, with a faint nod, he said, "Do that, and I'll make sure it doesn't walk away." A strange silence fell between them. Their hands brushed once as they both reached toward the same mark on the map. It was a fleeting touch, brief and unintentional, yet the jolt of awareness lingered. Kalen pulled back quickly, her tail flicking in agitation. Darius said nothing, but his jaw tightened, as though acknowledging silently what neither dared to voice. They set out again, the land turning harsher with every step. The obsidian plain stretched wide and open, a killing ground with no cover. Kalen's ears twitched nervously. The predator was near, its hunger brushing against her thoughts like a foul wind. "It knows," she whispered. "It tastes my fear already." Darius adjusted the satchel on his shoulder, the heavy charges clinking softly inside. His voice was calm, almost grimly amused. "Good. Let's give it something worth chasing." He sprinted toward the spires, boots hammering across the broken glassy plain. Kalen remained behind, her stance wide, her red hair whipping in the wind. She closed her eyes and drew inward, gathering all her anger, grief, and defiance. Then she released it in a single psychic scream. The ground vibrated as the beast responded. Its fury was a tidal wave in her mind, a boiling storm that made her knees buckle. Far across the plain, its vast black shape charged, a nightmare of muscle and chitin, racing toward her. "Darius, hurry," she gasped aloud, though her mind was already locked in a deadly duel with the creature's consciousness. At the spires, Darius planted the first charge, then the second, his fingers moving with practiced precision despite the tremors shaking the earth. Sweat poured down his face, his breath ragged, but he didn't falter. He climbed higher, wedging the third charge deep into a fissure. The predator closed in fast. Kalen could see its glowing eyes now, molten pits of hunger. She kept her focus sharp, pouring every shred of her rage into the psychic lure. "Here I am," she whispered, her ears flat against her skull, her tail bristling. "Come and choke on my fury." Darius leapt down the spire, rolling hard, detonator clutched in his fist. He hit the ground, turned, and raised the trigger. "Now, Kalen," he roared. She broke her concentration, spun, and ran with a speed born of desperation, her red hair streaming behind her. The predator lunged after her, its colossal weight tearing the plain apart. Darius waited until the monster was directly between the spires. He pressed the detonator. The explosion was not a single blast but a harmonic quake. The spires shuddered, then imploded inward in a cascade of pulverized stone. The beast bellowed, a sound of raw fury cut short as 100,000 tons of rock collapsed upon it. Kalen stumbled to a halt beside Darius, chest heaving, her fox ears twitching at the silence that followed. Dust rolled over the plain, blotting out the horizon. The predator was gone, buried, if not destroyed. For a long moment, they stood together in the settling haze, both trembling from the nearness of death. Kalen turned her face toward him, her eyes bright with something that was not just relief. "You trusted me," she said softly. Darius met her gaze, his expression weary but unyielding. "We didn't have a choice." Yet the air between them was thick with unspoken things, with a bond born not of choice but of necessity, sharpened into something fragile and undeniable. The wreck lay ahead like a wound in the land, its hull torn and half buried in purple dust. Darius slowed, his stride faltering at the sight of his ship, the Wanderer, ruined but not entirely lost. The prow was cracked deep into the ground, the aft twisted like a broken spine, yet parts of it still clung stubbornly to life. Kaelin stood beside him, her fox ears tilted forward, her red hair tangled from the storm. She said nothing, but her pale face revealed her exhaustion. Days of survival had stripped her of ritual, leaving only raw endurance. For once, she did not look like a priestess or a vessel of fate, but a woman clinging to what remained. Darius keyed in the override at the ramp. The hiss of equalized pressure was a blessed sound. Lights flickered weakly inside, shadows stretching down long corridors that smelled of metal and stale air. They stepped into silence that felt utterly foreign after the howling of the wild. "Safe," Darius muttered. "At least for now." He guided her through the halls to the med bay, sterile and humming faintly. Kaelin perched on the edge of the biobed, her tail curling tightly around her legs as Darius powered up the scanner. "This will check for internal damage," he said, voice deliberately professional. She unfastened the armor across her shoulders, exposing pale skin to the cold air. She didn't meet his eyes as he ran the scanner along her spine. The hum filled the room, but under it she felt the warmth of him close, his steady presence wrapping around her like a second heartbeat. Vulnerability gnawed at her, yet strangely, it did not feel like weakness. "You're clear," Darius said finally, setting the scanner aside. "Bruising, nothing more." He draped his jacket over her shoulders when she shivered. The fabric was rough, carrying the scent of dust and oil, yet it was warm. She pulled it tighter around herself, eyes flicking to his face, though she said nothing. Later, they sat in the dim cockpit, sharing a ration bar that tasted of chalk and sugar. Kaelin's voice was soft when she asked, "What is your world like?" "Green," Darius answered after a pause. "And blue. We have oceans that stretch beyond sight. Storms that roll across them like armies. Cities that scrape the sky." He smiled faintly. "And festivals where we celebrate things that don't matter, just because they make us feel alive." Kaelin listened in silence, her ears tilted forward, her gaze distant. Then she told him of her temples, silver-lit sanctuaries where silence carried more weight than words, where her people drowned their chaos in order and ritual. "We sought perfection," she said bitterly. "But perfection left us stagnant. And blind." The space between them narrowed, heavy with truths too large for words. He leaned in slowly, cautiously, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. Their lips met in a quiet, searching kiss, less hunger than surrender. A question answered not in words but in breath and closeness. But the moment ended when reality intruded. Darius pulled back, frowning toward the controls. "The comms array, if it's intact, I can send a distress call. But it'll take power. A lot." Kaelin's ears lowered. "And the beast will feel it." He nodded grimly. "If it's alive under that rubble, the signal will drag it straight here." "Do it," she said without hesitation. Her voice was steel. He threw the breaker. The ship roared awake, lights blazing, engines humming with dangerous energy. For one fragile heartbeat, there was only silence. Then, boom. The hull shook violently. Metal screamed under the impact. "It's here," Darius said, his eyes blazing. The beast tore at the aft section, ripping through the engine housing. Kaelin felt its presence hammering against her mind, a tide of hunger and rage. She staggered, clutching her temple. Darius scanned the schematic, hands flying across controls. "It's going for the core." Kaelin's eyes widened, realization dawning. "The core. If we overload it, the blast will consume it." He looked at her, breath caught, then nodded. "Yes. But we'll have less than 90 seconds to escape." "Guide it," she said fiercely. "I'll call it to the core." They set their plan in motion with frantic precision. Darius rerouted conduits, forcing the core into overload. The ship vibrated like a beast in pain, warning klaxons howling. Kaelin closed her eyes, drawing deep into her grief and rage, shaping them into a psychic spear. She thrust the image into the beast's mind, the pulsing lure of the reactor, a feast of raw power. It came. The Predator's immense body tore through the aft hull, clawing toward the energy source. Darius shouted over the alarms, "Overload in 90, go." They ran. Crawling through maintenance shafts, heat blistering, metal groaning around them, Kaelin's fox ears pinned flat as every second stretched like eternity. A jammed hatch blocked their way. Darius kicked the panel with desperate strength until it shrieked open. They scrambled through, lungs burning, the reactor's scream echoing in their bones. The forward hatch was ahead, a circle of light. They threw themselves out into the dust. "Brace!" Darius roared. The world vanished. White light devoured everything, silent and absolute. Then the shockwave struck, hurling them through the air. They landed hard, breath knocked from their lungs. Behind them, the aft half of the ship no longer existed. A crater glowed where the Predator had been. Smoke and silence. No beast. Only ruin. Then, on the console of the surviving cockpit, a green light blinked. A voice crackled through the static. "This is Rescue Vessel Vigilance. We are responding to your distress signal. Survivors, confirm status." Darius and Kaelin looked at one another, their bodies bruised, their faces streaked with soot. Rescue had come. The war with the beast was finished. But neither spoke of rescue. Kaelin reached up, brushing her fingers along his jaw, her fox ears lowering slightly as she touched the jacket still around her shoulders. In the silence, under a dawn no longer haunted by fate, they stood together, two survivors bound by fire, grief, and something far more fragile. The vigilance arrived without ceremony. Crews separated them swiftly, shuttling Darius to a human medbay, Kaelin to a xenobiology unit. The jacket was stripped away for decontamination. Protocol reduced their ordeal to sterile questions and clinical detachment. But the memory of their bond, born in fire and dust, would not be erased. And somewhere, beyond regulations and reports, the story of Kaelin and Darius had only just begun. And that brings us to the end of their struggle, a story of survival on the knife's edge, where belief and logic collided and something new was forged in the ruins. Kaelin, the fox-eared priestess with red hair and pale skin, walked into the jaws of death expecting peace, and instead found an unlikely ally who tore down her illusions but gave her life back. Darius, the weary wanderer, fought only to endure another day, and yet in Kaelin he discovered both the burden of truth and the spark of something worth protecting. The grave beast was more than just a predator. It was the shadow of arrogance, the embodiment of mistakes carved into ritual. Together, they faced it not as enemies divided by faith and science, but as partners united in resolve. And in doing so, they proved something greater, that even when the universe tears down everything you thought was sacred, it can still offer you a reason to stand again. When the rescue ship arrived, there were no parades, no triumphant fanfare. Just two souls who had seen the end and chosen to keep walking. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. If you enjoyed this journey of survival, of discovery, of hearts finding each other in the ashes, then stay with us for more. Like this video if the story kept you hooked, share it so others can step into this world, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next tale waiting just beyond the horizon. Because stories, like survivors, are stronger when they're not alone.